Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast. Alex here with Jacob again, as ever. And today we're going to be talking about integralism and postliberalism, hopefully, and the consequences that these things have for contemporary society.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Hello, everyone. Again, so basically, Alex has described what this will be about, hopefully, inshallah, God willing, and it's going to be, I suppose, a pretty broad discussion about various sort of options that are being developed in the current, or that have come out of the current moment in Western political discourse that propose or purport to move beyond liberalism in some way, and the merits or significance that any of these may or may not have. So, yes, perhaps, Alex, you'd like to start by explaining your general views and impressions of this subject?
Well, essentially, what we're talking about here is this word integralism that we mentioned essentially refers to any sort of political ideology or political philosophy which views a transcendent or religious aspect of the people's personal lives to be integral to the governance of a state, or to put it more, perhaps more traditionally, to make a view towards God the ultimate aim of any political action or interaction. So that could be something as simple as basing one's laws off of some kind of scriptural revelation, or more broadly, it could mean promoting a religious worldview amongst the populace such that religious morality is never disconnected from any action that the state might take. So it doesn't always necessarily refer to a complete amalgamation of church and state, or religion and state in the Christian world at least, but it does refer to a religious institution and the state closely cooperating. And that essentially is the basics of what we're talking about. So from a Christian point of view, this kind of thinking has its roots in the patristic tradition, but more famously in Thomistic philosophy. Thomas Aquinas' political philosophy is essentially the groundwork for most, at least Roman Catholic interpretations of integralism. In the Orthodox world, we have a similar concept called symphonia, which essentially means a kind of harmony between the civil law and the law of God, or the rules and regulations of the church. So this idea of integralism, put bluntly, is to do with how civil life or civil society interacts with non-secular or religious society.
So as we're starting with this specific concept of integralism, would it be fair for those, as a way of describing it to those who are not familiar, to say that it's almost a non-theocratic form of religious governance, in that it's not necessarily that religious leaders should rule, but that the state should be grounded in religious principles? Is that a fair characterization?
That's broadly a fair characterization. It wouldn't necessarily exclude all religious leaders from having some kind of political position. There might well be a place for them within government, but probably not, as you say, as the leaders of a government. But it would necessarily connect a religious disposition to the government, I think, is probably a good way to think about it.
So I suppose my first question there, which you've already touched on, is to what extent, since it is a concept which seems to be linked to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church in particular, is this separable from that specific religious tradition and has a wider currency with regard to other traditions?
It does. It certainly can do. I think it certainly is able to be applied to other Christian traditions, and most Christian denominations have some kind of interpretation of it. The Kingdom of England and its relationship to the Anglican Church for a long time established a position that was not dissimilar, although perhaps not quite the same, by nature of the fact that the Church of England is a state church and formally the monarch of our kingdom is the head of the church. That's not a concept that's present in integralism, but the way in which that practically worked was similar-ish to Catholic integralism. Now, the Church of England is essentially an offshoot of Catholicism, so that might not be the best example to use. As I've mentioned, there's a similar concept in Orthodox philosophy, but looking outside of Christianity, really, you don't see at least a separation of religion and statecraft in the same way that you see in modern secular society, and really any time in history. I mean, you do sometimes have a separation of the roles of the church and the state, but you don't always have a separation of the values of a religion from the state. That is quite a modern idea. It really originates from the Enlightenment.
Yes. So I suppose, well, I have a couple of concerns about this particular concept. So I'm quite aware of various people who are proposing this as a kind of political ideology. So one thing is, to what extent are we just dressing up what is actually human normalcy? Because as you said, until the Enlightenment, the idea that a state would not in some way be based on religious principles was more or less unthinkable. So to what extent is this just describing what was absolutely normal and indeed unquestionable for humans for 99% of our history, and then turning it into an ideology and another option in the shopping cart of belief systems, or contender for some kind of supremacy? How far is this an issue, that we're just over-analyzing what's actually just the natural human state?
I mean, it's probably a fair criticism. As I say, if you look at the origins of this concept, this integralist concept in the Fathers, Christian writers like Tertullian and Origen, very, very early Christian writers, essentially they didn't really give much thought at all to politics. They just sort of said, yes, well, God is the king of all creation, and so yeah, it makes sense that we have a monarchy, and it makes sense that the monarchy sort of upholds the laws which, these are the moral laws which God has set down for us. That was just kind of obvious to them. And I do see what you mean insofar as, if it's obvious, then why do you need to dress it up as an ideology? I think the reason why we're tempted to dress the things up like this and to give them a particular name is because there are, as you say, so many different ideological options, and people feel as though they need to compete in this sort of market of ideas. That might not be the best way to go about it. And ultimately, for a Christian, it's related to this idea of natural laws and sort of the innate human tendency towards order and stability and all these sorts of things. So, for the most part, I think it's just a way of expressing an idea which has already been established in human history for a very long time. Really, what we call it isn't that important. What is important is what it stands for.
Yes, okay. I see. So I suppose another issue that I have is almost at the other end of the spectrum. I mean, if there may be a problem of being too general, there sometimes also seems to me to be an issue of it being too specific and too tied to a very precise conception of exactly how state and religious authorities should interact. Now, there are different rules on this in Islam and in different branches of Christianity, but how far is that a helpful discussion to have in a context where one is so far away from these things being realistically achieved in the Western world?
I think, on the one hand, it's important to look into, at least for the sake of theory, what the boundaries should be between, say, a church and a state. Because if such an integralist system was to take root again by chance, then these boundaries would need to be established, or at least the way in which the church and state interacted would need to be worked out beforehand. But on the other hand, as you say, it doesn't seem likely that any state really is going to do this anytime soon. So insofar as that's the case, and it's going to remain the case for a long time, I think more important things to do are promoting the specifically religious values over and above the political ones. Because more often than not, the political implications of ideologies like integralism just follow on from the religious concepts anyway. So if you can imbue a sort of a traditional revival, if that's the right word, of Christianity, or indeed any religion, then any political consequences of that should follow quite naturally, especially since, as we've said, many of the political prescriptions of religion are just related to the, as you termed it, normalcy, which people feel when they're part of that kind of faith tradition.
Yes. If there were to be some kind of religious revival in the Western world, whatever form that took, would this... I suppose there is still a sense in which, having gone through the process of the Enlightenment and the intellectual fragmentation that it produced and all the changes that brought in train, I suppose there might still be a sense in which a return to the pre-modern normalcy is no longer possible, and something maybe entirely new would be worked out as a social order. I don't know what your thoughts are on that notion, or if you agree, or if so, what this new order could possibly look like.
Well, you're right in that you can't re-establish something which is, I suppose you would say, has been superseded, because on the one hand, however much we might romanticize some of these older forms of government, they're long gone, and even if someone tried to bring them back, they wouldn't quite come back in the same way. And for one thing, people today don't think like medieval people think. That's one thing that's very obvious. And it's one of the main problems with academia, is that when historians try to analyze the way that people lived in the medieval period, for instance, a lot of them fall flat on their faces because they just can't get into their heads that people thought differently, that people in those times didn't think like the modern secular liberal. Now, it's the case that even people like you and I probably don't think like medieval people either. And so if there was to be a resurgence of this kind of political order, it wouldn't look like, or at least it wouldn't look exactly like a medieval state, for instance. So in terms of what it might look like today, I think it would be a sort of, for one thing, it would have to take measures which ensured that the order was sustainable long term. And how exactly that is achievable, I think, really derives from values that people in society have. And so again, I think it just comes back to the idea of what values do people practicing in their day-to-day lives have. They don't really have any meaningful values at the moment. I'm interested in your views on this, actually, because I know that you've often spoken about how if, say, for instance, pornography was illegal, fewer people would use pornography. That seems to follow, because if it's illegal, it's not as accessible, just as for sake of example. But when it comes to promoting traditional values or virtues amongst the populace at large, and as you say, it's not exactly an easy task to go about outlawing certain things or making moral prescriptions in law how we would want it, immediately speaking, how do you think we should go about promoting virtues amongst the general population today?
Well, from the standpoint of truth and eternity, obviously my sincere hope is that as many people as possible convert to Islam and enter into the final compact that God has provided us for salvation. Obviously, that's necessarily what I ardently hope for. Of course, there are also one can also, however, say that there is, although I hold this to be the final truth, it's not to say that there is no truth in other religious dispensations. We have the concept of the people of the book, which is primarily Jews and Christians, whose religions were founded in a true revelation, because of course we hold all of the prophets to have originally to be genuine prophets, peace be upon them. So there's truth in those religions, and to that extent they're also preferable to atheism and indifference. There may even be truth in other non-Abrahamic religious traditions. There's speculation among many Orthodox Islamic scholars, for example, that Confucius or even people like Krishna in the Hindu tradition or the Buddha may have been prophets. We don't know. God knows best. We don't know. But they may well have been. And in any case, there are certain very admirable values in those traditions. So one can also say that there is some kind of, there's also this notion of the fitra, this natural state, this natural condition of human nature, which has certain virtues and values when it is not corrupted by an abnormal social order, which of course we have now. We have a highly abnormal social order. So there are all these respects in which one can hope for a revival of human virtues. Really, it seems to be tied to religion. Of course, one hopes that I hope that it is Islam. If it is not, other religions also are vehicles through which certain virtues can be achieved. So the fundamental thing is religion. And this is a modern dilemma to be in, because in all societies previously, religion was not really separable as a sphere of activity, except in some very, very abstracted way from other areas of life. Everything was imbued with a transcendent, if you go back to the European Middle Ages or before that. So to recover that, we have to now think about things in terms of this category of religion, which just means any kind of ordering principle through which people connect to some sense of transcendence. And yes, and that seems to me also to be to be the only way in which these virtues can be recovered, not just because of the truth within them and not just because of this notion of the fitra, but also because they are the only things that can really provide what we might call a substantive worldview. So you mentioned that people don't really have real values. Of course, they believe in things like, the modern Westerners believe in things like freedom and equality. But I think what we mean by saying they're not real values, they don't give you ordering principles by which to run your life. So you're still left in this kind of anomy and uncertainty. And it's only really religion. Some philosophies also try to do this, but many of them, in doing so, actually approximate to religions, because they concern themselves with transcendent things and then involve themselves in practices that are not merely intellectual. You look at Plato, for example, and his theory of the forms clearly had a very strong religious dimension, with this intellectual intuition through which you acquire a insight into the metaphysical ultimate. It's a kind of philosopher's religion. So,
well, some early Christian writers thought that Plato might have been divinely inspired to recognize that there was one God, although it's just a speculation.
Yeah, so we call these, it's speculation, but who knows? It may well have been. I've seen speculation among Muslim scholars that Socrates may have been a prophet. You look at some of the speeches in his trial, where he talks about how he doesn't fear death because he knows there will be a far greater judgment afterwards, of far more consequence. He seems to speak about this kind of radical monotheism in this day of judgment. Yeah, but it's all about religion. I mean, as I say, it's a modern problem. It's a modern thing to even talk about. But yeah, to recover humanity, you have to recover religion. That's the fundamental the fundamental core of humanity.
And since you talk about that, one of the people I wanted to bring in today was John Milbank and his so-called radical orthodox tendency, which primarily started, for those who don't know, as John Milbank is an Anglican theologian, and he wrote a book called Radical Orthodoxy, amongst others, in which he essentially argues that in today's world, where, especially in Christianity, and especially in certain denominations of Christianity, such as Anglican, the Church of England, which has increasingly in the past few decades adopted liberal forms of theology, which involve essentially the denial of the possibility of miraculous events and other such, well, frankly, heresies, as far as an Orthodox Christian is concerned, an Orthodox with a small o. So John Milbank suggests that it's in fact more radical to believe in the Orthodox doctrines of Christianity, such as the virgin birth, for instance, being one example of a widely denied doctrine in liberal Christianity, which has almost become a new orthodoxy amongst the liberal establishment of theologians in this country. And so people like Milbank essentially say, in today's age, it's more radical to assert that no, actually, Jesus was born of a virgin, and it is indeed a miracle. And I suspect that that's something which you and many other Muslims could sympathize with.
Yeah, so the general position, of course, of retrieving foundational truths is hugely important. I suppose it does seem, why call it radical? Why not just call it orthodoxy? Why not? Why make such a song and dance out of returning to what is essential to one's religious tradition anyway? Of course, it is obviously something that will put one at odds with certain aspects of the current state of society, but primarily the point of it is to be orthodox, not to be radical, because the point is to be on the truth. The radicalism or otherwise of truth is pretty secondary.
I see what you mean. And as far as I'm concerned, I basically agree with you. I think if you are an Orthodox Christian in the sense that you believe in the correct or the traditional doctrines, then you're an Orthodox Christian, and that's pretty much where the matter ends. But I suppose this is maybe one problem with Milbank, because it's a problem with other writers, and you've written about this before with people such as Burke, but in responding to a liberal order, they essentially frame their arguments in terms of liberal language. So as far as many modern liberals are concerned, it's stating, oh yeah, a virgin birth happened. That is pretty radical, because as far as everyone's concerned, it didn't. So I suppose that's why he uses the term radical, because from his own perspective, and Milbank himself is by no means right-leaning particularly. I mean, he has some right, sort of maybe conservative tendencies insofar as he promotes a conservative view on religion, but I mean, he has his origins in Labour Party politics and the sort of Christian left. I mean, that's not a bad thing. The Christian left has so many interesting insights to offer. But what it means is that when he does have to frame his arguments for a sort of Christian orthodoxy, he almost feels obliged to do so within the context of existing left-wing views. I think maybe that's the issue.
Yes, the Christian left, which I suppose ties into this blue Labour movement, which seems to exist mainly among quite small groups of intellectuals, as far as I'm aware, in Britain, seems to have, maybe it's a false impression that I've gained, but it seems to have withered away into almost nothing. You have this, I don't know, would it be fair to characterise Milbank as an integralist? Is that an accurate description, do you think?
I don't know if he'd use that term to describe himself, but some of his ideas are certainly lifted from that line of thinking, yeah.
Mm. Well,
He's certainly a Thomist.
right, yeah. Yeah, so as far as I understand it, his theology inspired the sort of political writings of Philip Blond, who was in some ways his disciple. And this briefly became very politically fashionable through his influence on the Conservative Party through the so-called Big Society around 2011. But the thing about this is that the closer it gets to real politics, the more it seems to be watered down into nothing and become this very, very anodyne set of platitudinous things about tradition, combined with what is just indistinguishable or nearly indistinguishable liberal technocracy with maybe a slightly communitarian flavour added into it. Philip Blond's think tank Res Publica, for example, you look at what they publish, you look at the kind of discussions and debates that they host, and it seems to be indistinguishable from the rest of the centrist, liberal, technocratic political world. And it makes me think there's something very toxic about the whole air almost in Britain. I think it's quite a specifically British problem that these movements that appear to have very good principles end up dying in our political culture and have to either articulate themselves in terms of a banal liberalism or disappear entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've ever read Blond's book, Red Tory, but on the face of it, reading through it, it's quite a good book. It makes some very valid points and valid criticisms of essentially the cause of the 2008 financial crisis, which was essentially the consequences of liberalism, which is social atomization and economic exploitation, really. So in that sense, it seems on the face of things a pretty good manifesto for change. But as you say, look at Res Publica now. They're essentially spending a lot of their time publishing papers which justify the government's latest set of iniquities or whatever. So it doesn't really seem to be able to gain meaningful traction in the political sphere. I think part of the problem is people like Blond and Milbank and Maurice Glasman, who's another Blue Labour figure, is that they come from very meaningful and very genuine philosophical or intellectual positions, but then they associate their acts with established political parties, and as a consequence, they've immediately lost. As soon as they try to enter politics, at least in that way, they haven't really got any chance of making a meaningful distinction, because the parties just aren't really interested and never really are going to be in their present state. I think that's one of the issues.
I do think the rot, as it were, in these movements goes a bit deeper, because there's a problem where you argue, as Blond does in that book you mentioned, Red Tory, for hierarchy and tradition as the ordering principles of society rather than individualism. But you do so in this very abstract way that isn't tied to any specific view of order and hierarchy. And it becomes clear, I think, that he doesn't actually have the stomach to accept the order and hierarchy that existed in pre-1960s Britain, for example, which in some respects he praises, but he doesn't have the courage really to say that is better than the status quo. And therefore, without a specific vision of order and hierarchy, these values just, they have nothing to grasp on, and it becomes very easy for them just to be over-specified until the actual specification of them is just some technocratic tweaking to the welfare state, which isn't actually a change to values at all. It's just a change to certain institutional, certain institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair criticism. Blond is an interesting thinker, but for the most part, as you say, the book kind of talks about hierarchy and tradition and then makes the odd genuflection to the NHS and the welfare state and other political projects which whilst they may derive from a certain respectable political tendency, have established themselves these days in quite an unhelpful and damaging, frankly, way. It's like the culture in Britain now that we don't have religion, or more people are congregants of the NHS than they are congregants of the Church of England. It's very much sort of buys into that tendency that if we don't have transcendence, well, at least we can find it in the BBC and the NHS and all these other things which have replaced other timeless values. Because as far as many people are concerned, these things are timeless and they're never going to go away. Although I for one sincerely hope they do at some point, because they can be quite insufferable. But
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's necessarily anything wrong with, you may probably agree, there's nothing necessarily wrong with having a national health service in principle, or indeed a welfare state. But yes, the way in which they've come to be treated and regarded is, very troubling. There's this dreadful cliche that the NHS is our national religion, which is probably true in that our religion is mammon and the worship of the self, because although there is obviously a commendable value of charity and compassion, which in our contemporary conditions probably does, at least to some extent, have to be expressed through state action. But that aside, although that's commendable, to identify that solely with protecting people's physical health for the sake of this world is actually no better from a spiritual or religious standpoint than the obsession with GDP and boosting our national income through neoliberalism. It's just the other side of the same coin. This same obsession with making life more and more comfortable, but caring nothing about what is beyond it. There are also, perhaps you have enough to respond to there. I don't know. You seem maybe a little troubled by the suggestion there was nothing wrong with these things in principle. Maybe you don't agree with that?
No, I agree that there's certainly nothing wrong in principle with a welfare state. I think it certainly has a place in a limited sense. I think there's almost a moral responsibility upon the state to show some degree of oversight towards the poor and the needy. But as you say, on the other hand, they've kind of been idolized and turned into these things in Britain today have become idolized and turned into some sort of, as you say, sort of quasi-national religion. So I think I agree with you more than I maybe came across. So I think essentially what we can agree upon here is that this sort of radical orthodox tendency in religion is really just orthodoxy, or returning to the religion's genuine roots, away from some sort of liberal perversion. And on the other hand, this sort of political school of thought that has arisen out of it is essentially a kind of form of left-wing conservatism or conservative liberalism, which, as you say, found expressions in David Cameron's Big Society, a big society which never really materialized because, as you say, it was mostly an abstract thought, not ever a meaningful reality. And there was never any attempts to establish a meaningful communitarian economic governance or anything like that after the 2008 crisis. So really, many of these projects seem doomed to fail from the off.
Yeah, I think what these movements tend to want is they want to eliminate the costs of liberalism through its atomization and social disintegration without being willing to give up on the commitments to the substantive commitments to freedom and equality. They want to keep those things, but somehow eliminate the downsides of liberalism, which actually you can't do, because those values, as they are interpreted by liberalism, are not compatible with any specific worldview that offers alternative values or any genuinely orthodox religion. So this I think actually connects also to the general phenomenon of what we might call post-liberalism, which is a little broader than this sort of integralist movement. There are also, there have of course been various noises about the end of liberalism. You think of, I think of Deneen's book, which I've not read, but I'm aware of the general line of argument there, and similar intellectual currents. And it seems that they have the same problem. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of his book, Deneen talks about how in moving away from liberalism, one of the, or rather, he equates the move away from liberalism to a move to a more genuinely liberal system in which permissive values and progressive dogmas are no longer imposed upon people through a dismantling of the kind of liberal structure. But if your reason for opposing liberalism is that it's not liberal enough, you become completely trapped in the system, if you like, the liberal system. It's incredibly slippery and difficult to completely extricate your thinking from it, as these post-liberal thinkers show. They don't actually offer an alternative vision.
Well, it puts me in mind of how when Roger Scruton, and the English conservative writer, reflects upon people like Adam Smith, he finds some meaningful insights insofar as he's able to show Adam Smith is not a liberal in the modern sense. But at the same time, one can't deny that people of his school are certainly the progenitors of the direction that modern liberalism took. So there is a certain danger in flirting too much with older forms of liberalism, or liberalism in its more organic state, if that's the right word to use. Not to say that there's nothing to be gained by doing so, but certainly, there was a book, I don't know if you've read it, it's called it's called The Royalist Revolution, and it effectively tries to argue that the American Revolutionary War of Washington and the founding fathers of America was royalist in nature, and it wasn't actually about separating from the Great British Kingdom. It was about restoring certain monarchist values. I'm not so sure about it myself, but it's an example of trying to read sort of conservative ideas into older forms of liberalism. And however noble that might be, it doesn't always work, because simply, like in the case of the American War of Independence, it's simply not the case that the people who led it were monarchists. And so you're never going to be able to get a meaningful monarchist reading of it out of it without some degree of forcing the conclusions. So I think there's certainly reason to be cautious when it comes to analysing liberalism itself in the way that post-liberal thinkers sometimes do, in terms of forming an alternative to liberalism over and against it.
Yes, that's very interesting. I mean, the American Revolution is something quite well. So I suppose initially this point about monarchism in the American Revolution is interesting, because although you are of course right that hardly any of the revolutionaries wanted to retain a monarchy as such, I think you do find in writing some people like Hamilton, and later in the Federalist Party in the early years of the Republic, a tendency to try to recreate the monarchy through the institution of the presidency, and also to recreate the aristocracy through a kind of privileging of the landed elite. So they don't necessarily want to break with the constitutional and political structure of England, though to say they're actually monarchists in a literal sense is false. But one thing about the American Revolution, perhaps on a slight tangent here, which I find extremely interesting, is that it fits perfectly into a pattern that you see throughout the history of Western colonialism and British colonialism, perhaps in particular, but I can think of many examples of it outside this outside of British colonialism as well, where every time a settler movement gained autonomy from the government of the metropole, the government back home in the colonizing power, it spelled a disaster for the native people of that colony and a radicalization of the racialist ideology that the settling process was grounded in. So the United States is obviously a very good example here when you look at what happened to the actual Americans when the English settlers gained autonomy. And one can, there's even a, to quite a significant extent, the revolution was triggered by the British Crown's attempt to protect the Native Americans to some extent from colonial encroachment. There was a compact in 1763 where the Crown declared they were not allowed to expand west beyond the Appalachians, and the colonists hated this. That was one of the reasons for their anger at the central government. And that compact was still in force north of the 49th parallel in Canada, and was one of the reasons that there was actually far less violence in the admittedly still often brutal and exploitative expropriation of the natives there, because it was at least to some small extent regulated by a power that was less brutal in its attitudes. So that the purchase of land had to be regulated and approved by the Crown rather than being privatized and therefore a chaotic process. So this, yeah, I mean, you see this throughout colonial history. You see it in Australia, where the savagery of the colonists towards the natives there was generally opposed by well-meaning but ignorant people back home in Britain. When 1900, when Australia was gained confederation, it led to almost immediately to the White Australia policy of preventing Chinese immigration, which was opposed by Westminster. And then in the 20th century, you have obviously apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia under white minority rule, both of which were opposed by the original colonizing power when they happened, which is not to absolve the central colonizing power of complicity in any of this, but there is this dynamic, and the American Revolution perfectly exemplifies it. So I realize I've gone off on a tangent here, but perhaps one should see it more as another part of this long process of settler colonist anger and interference in their treatment of natives rather than a liberal revolution. But this does tie into the point you made earlier about earlier forms of liberalism, because one of the better or commendable features of the kind of pre-1960s form of liberalism was that it was still tied to certain moral rules, and it didn't in any way undermine the traditional Western, if I may be so blunt, attempt to suppress sexuality, or at least to control it, which was pretty fundamental to Western civilization, and was not generally opposed by the forces of the Enlightenment. One thinks of poor Immanuel Kant, who had to tie his hands to the bedspread to prevent self-abuse, but he had this secular justification for the old religious idea that was just as strong and compelling for him. So it was tied to these moral rules, and then you look at people like, I think Smith had similar notions. You look at John Locke, who's now this supposed to be a liberal figure whose views can be invoked as part of a tradition that justifies the status quo. And yet he said explicitly that the freedom to do what is immoral is not real freedom, and for the law to restrict it is not really a limit on freedom. So that was one dimension of it, which was largely a good thing in that at least had some connection to values that were necessary for social functioning. But there was also this other dimension where it seemed to be connected to a development of racial ideology and racial consciousness through the imperial and colonizing processes we described. Well, this other key feature was the division between the in-group of, roughly speaking, white people and the out-group of everyone else. And that was also kind of fundamental to this pre-1960 society. And the collapse of it is, it's hard to argue with me anything but a good thing. And yet, it seems so fundamental to human nature to have an in-group and an out-group, that one could also see it as perhaps some kind of perverted attempt to maintain something of human normalcy. So yeah, I've gone on a bit of a rant, on a tangent there, but I think to sum up, the important point is just this twofold change between the very different pre-1960s forms of liberalism that once existed and the contemporary forms, which consist mainly in the change in sexual morality and in attitudes to race, and it has other secondary dimensions. But this change, yeah, is one of the ways in which we misread the past, as you pointed out. I guess you've got a lot to respond to there.
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with most of what you said. I think the main problem is when it comes to people like Locke, one of the things I often point out when I talk to people about this is that one of Locke's most often cited works in favour of the status quo is his essay on tolerance, and tolerance is a big thing these days. But if you actually read it, which it seems to be a lot of liberals actually haven't, at least in detail, yes, it says that the English nation should tolerate other forms of Protestantism insofar as Locke considered England to be a Protestant nation. But he berated Roman Catholics, and he believed that Roman Catholics should be tolerated under no circumstances because he saw them as loyal to a foreign leader, the Pope, potential sort of fifth column within the Kingdom of England. It's really quite an illiberal thing to say, and many of the things that Locke and his ilk wrote about are only illiberal insofar as one can apply a liberal interpretation to them. They weren't really liberals in any sort of consistent sense. Well, I mean, people might say, well, that's just to do with their times, but it's in a similar sense, many liberals today cannot really give a good answer as to why something like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which is essentially a defense of absolutism, is also a cornerstone of liberal ideology in terms of one of its founding texts. I mean, the reason why is because it promotes a form of enlightened despotism, but even then, it's essentially the sort of state that it promotes, which is essentially an enlightened despot ruling according to a kind of biblical exegesis, or a Protestant biblical exegesis, is the modern liberal's worst nightmare. So I think, broadly speaking, you've hit the nail on the head when it comes to misinterpreting the past thinkers.
Yes, it is part of the liberal tradition's almost inherent nature that it doesn't understand the past, which I think is because it has this inherent instability. It's constantly changing and evolving, such that it sees the forms it took a few decades ago as unconscionable. You know, you see that all the time when there was this a few months ago, or was it last year, where Netflix released old episodes of Friends and everyone complained they were homophobic. I mean,
yeah.
20 years ago that people complained about that show because it was degenerate, and you know, which of course it is. It's also awful, but it just shows how fast these values change. And liberalism has always had that dynamic. There's actually a book I think it's by Nick Ferrari, who's written a book called The Myth of Liberalism, arguing that there isn't such a thing as liberalism that can be identified and analyzed, because it is this very, very unstable, constantly changing process that is not even aware of its own. It's not even self-aware. It's not even self-aware of this process. I don't know. Yeah, would you agree with that notion that there isn't really such a thing as liberalism? How far are we just trying to pin something on a chimera, on a shadow?
I think when we say liberalism, we're just referring to the present order, which makes vague allusions to equality and liberty, but in such an abstract sense that these things are not qualified by anything, and so they have no real meaning on their own. I suppose we call it liberalism because, as I say, they make these genuflections towards these supposedly timeless values such as tolerance and what have you. But really, when the fathers of liberalism, if that's the right term to use, referred to these things, they were referring to them in ways which don't really resemble modern liberal thought at all. So in that sense, liberalism is a shapeless beast. It's kind of a bogart. It adopts whatever form it likes, according to what sort of the most degenerate thing it can find in the age in which it exists. Almost, it's essentially a kind of antagonist figure, if you like, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I think one interesting idea that Charles Taylor has is that we shouldn't talk so much about ideologies in explaining the modern world. We should talk about social imaginaries, which are pre-conscious and pre-reflective. They're not things we consciously hold. They're not principles, because, as you say, these principles like freedom are so vague they can mean almost anything. Freedom is always qualified in practice. Even now, we don't allow you the freedom to take heroin or to end your life in the way you want. So what really determines, or what really is the driver of this dynamic is and one could also say what is really the foundation of the liberal society is a change in the social imaginary from a hierarchical one, and one could say almost an integralist one, in which people stood necessarily in a certain relationship to each other and to God that was, if you like, differentiated internally, so that there was a certain special value in being a noble, or indeed in having a certain role in society, like being a merchant or a member of a guild or whatever. Yeah. And there were all these different ways of being human that all had a commonality, but were all connected in different ways to a transcendent order. And then he talks about how this was replaced by a new social imaginary, which was flattened, where there was only one type of human, there was only one, or at most two, ranks of authority between humans, and above them God, perhaps in between them an authoritarian king in a manner of Hobbes's Leviathan. But there was a flattened social imaginary, so we no longer had the sense that there were specific duties of different kinds of people. There was just this individualized view of humanity in an aggregate under God. And then it took a long time, however, for the under God bit to disappear, which was why Locke and people of his time still believed in substantial restrictions on freedom in the name of religion. And of course, Locke was really a theological thinker whose views are probably not at all justifiable without his theology, as you say.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Most philosophy from that period, it's quite a modern thing to distinguish philosophy from theology. In that period, they were all sort of lumped together. It wasn't really until the 19th century that this distinction began to be made, as philosophers became more analytic in their scope and distanced themselves from theological thinking, which they rejected as abstract and in some cases even sort of ridiculous. So I think your point is fair.
So in terms of something more specific then, to come back to this idea of integralism or religious-based politics, or whatever one wants to call it, if I can just ask you one specific question, how would you envisage Islam being treated in a Christian or an Eastern Orthodox integralist society? I ask because obviously, though this probably applies far more to Western Christianity and to the Roman Catholic tradition, there was a long history of suppression and persecution. So I ask this because I think a lot of Muslims have this doubt about conservative Christianity as a force for good, because they believe that although the secular liberal order may have problems, it at least allows tolerance for our religion, whereas a conservative Christianity may not do so. So what are your views on that subject?
Well, I mean, even from the Roman Catholic position today, it's not the 1300s, so even if there was to be a Roman Catholic integralist society, I don't think it would seriously consider persecuting Muslims directly, because it is a different time period, and as you say, you're never going to bring back that exact sort of state that existed before. If you read someone like Aquinas, essentially Aquinas is writing in a time when Islam, well, certainly in his country, in Italy, Islam was not really present at all. And so Aquinas says, for instance, it's acceptable to have a group such as the Jews living alongside us because they follow an earlier revelation, and they can have a role in society. It might not be perfect, but they can be tolerated. But certain heretical groups and apostates, there's a case to be made for not tolerating them, because if the state is founded upon Christian virtues and that is opposed, then there's a certain threat to the integrity of the state. Now, I think Muslims have a place in society, in such a society today, not least because Christians and Muslims, certainly Orthodox Christians and Muslims, share not only a kind of rough geographical heritage in terms of the origin of their religion, but also, broadly speaking, with some exceptions, of course, at least they can agree upon what's morally right. I mean, Muslims and Christians can agree that adultery is unacceptable, that drunkenness is unacceptable. I mean, Christians are permitted to drink alcoholic drinks, but they're not permitted to get drunk. For instance, now, Islam deals with this by prohibiting all alcohol. But there have been Christian temperance movements throughout history. It's not unknown. There is common ground. And it's certainly possible, I think, for Muslims to be able to have their own communities, to have their mosques, to worship, and to be full citizens of the civil society. So whilst it would be, the state would have laws which were based upon a Christian interpretation of moral law, and Muslims would be bound by that. They would be free to practice their Islam, and they wouldn't be bound by any prescriptions that the church would make. But at the same time, if they had certain religious prescriptions which the civil law did not allow for, then within the context of their own communities, they would probably, I know I'm sort of speculating here, but they would probably have the freedom to be able to follow whatever rules they liked, so long as it didn't directly contravene the civil law.
Mm-hmm.
So it might even be possible for, like, there's a lot of fuss made in the UK about Sharia courts now. For the most part, I think it makes sense that if you have a legal system, you can't have a completely independent one competing with it. But if Muslims wanted to have Sharia courts within their own self-contained communities, and these Sharia courts were sort of overseen by the state, and they were sort of, all their judgments were kept on record alongside other state courts, Christian courts, then I don't see why they couldn't exist alongside a Christian legal system, even if even if maybe the scope of its judgments was limited in some way.
That's a very interesting vision there, because it's actually very similar to the historic Islamic treatment of Christians and Jews. The Ottomans had the millet system, for example, but this was really what was normative in most of Islamic history, where you have, as you described, the other religions can follow their own laws in their own communities, and those laws are normative for them. So you have this internal bifurcation, but within a state that is ultimately based on the values of, well, in your case, Christianity, but in our case, Islam. And this actually, yes, it seems to give more freedom of religion in some respects to the other faiths than the current secular system does, since they have the freedom to be bound by their own religious laws. But one concern I have is that, though, I mean, you say the times have changed and so on, but there is still this problem that although it's normative in Islam to view Christianity as containing a great deal of truth, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the other way around, because of course Christianity came before the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and therefore saw his religious community as not the guardians of a corrupted but valid earlier truth, but as deviants and heretics who came to attack God's order. And that, I think, is the reason, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason that Aquinas and other people whose views were authoritative in Christianity did not want to tolerate it. So how far has that changed, and how far could or indeed should that change from the Christian standpoint?
On the one hand, as you say, it's in the Western world, it's certainly because of, but more generally, Christianity does view Islam as a heresy. But, and Aquinas, as you say, suggests heretics should be punished and they should not be tolerated. In the Eastern Christian tradition, I mean, for the most part, because the Byzantine Empire collapsed, Eastern Christians were under Islamic polities for most of their existence, and for the most part, they still are. So I think really it comes down to two things. First of all is civility on behalf of the Christian. The teachings of the early fathers are very clear that everyone, no matter what his religion is a creation of God, and that gives him a certain amount of respect that he's entitled to. But even putting this aside, as I say, nowadays we can see Islam a little bit better, a little bit more. We've had the opportunity, perhaps, that one of the things modernity has allowed us to do is to view it a little bit more with an open mind, because we're not quite as bound by the prescriptions of the church as much as we once were. So it allows us to incorporate an appreciation of where the other religious traditions are coming from. I think, broadly speaking, most forms of monotheism can be tolerated because most monotheistic traditions tend towards the same truths, because I think they're derived from the same sort of revelations from the same God. And some of them might be more corrupt than others. But like if you look at something like Zoroastrianism, for example, many of its teachings are strikingly similar to Christianity's. And it's a monotheistic religion. And as you said before, there's varying views on people such as Confucius, who doesn't quite use the word God, but he certainly seems to equate this idea of a single heaven with a single God. It's a little bit unclear what he means, but there's certainly a sense that monotheism converges on some home truths which are consistent throughout all monotheistic, or most monotheistic faiths. So I think that is what Christians would do well to remember, and it's what some Christians appreciate a little better than others. I think this is important in terms of framing any kind of future state like this.
To what extent does this constitute a revision to Christian orthodoxy? And if it does, to what extent is that justified?
I don't think it's a revision per se. Christian political thought has always made a distinction between Christian faithful and non-Christian faithful but citizens, and it encourages us to be respectful. Essentially, all being, as far as the church on its own is concerned, being a heretic just means that you can't have the sacraments. It means that you can't participate in worship unless you've expressed an intention to join the church. So really, in terms of modern society, it doesn't involve a renunciation of orthodoxy. It just means perhaps that the state doesn't have the obligation as it once did to punish heretics. I mean, there are thousands of people out there today who profess some form of Christianity which traditionally the church would consider to have been heretical. And they're certainly not punished at all. So I don't see why that you can't apply a degree of economy to this interpretation of orthodoxy, which historically, at least in the Eastern Church, this idea of oikonomia, which in Greek kind of means good housekeeping, can apply. So we may not the church may not have anything to do with Islam, but it doesn't have to because it's a separate religion.
Mm. Okay. So interesting. So I suppose it seems we're perhaps coming to a logical end of this discussion.
Yeah.
But there's one thing I wanted to ask you first, which is as this whole, well, as we both seem to agree that any prospect for a move away from liberalism for the better rather than for the worse is, well, actually, that itself might be a point to consider. Is there a danger that as liberalism disintegrates or appears to disintegrate, if this actually continues, we may end up with a status quo that is worse? We may end up moving not towards a revival of traditional normalcy, but towards some other form of modernism that is actually worse and more destructive than liberalism?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about, isn't there, about another financial crisis precipitating, if not one world government, then some kind of supranational form of governance, which we wouldn't want.
Mm. And there are also, dangers, I suppose, of revival of some kind of ultra-nationalism or some kind of quasi-fascist system.
Yeah. This is always
paganism, even.
When as we do, we talk about the potential that exists in the collapse of a present order. There's always going to be these risks that extreme movements or undesirable movements come in to fill the void. I suppose for people such as us, the best thing we can do is trust that whatever happens in that regard is the will of God. Surely He knows best in terms of how people should govern themselves. And most of the time, when nations fall into iniquity and destroy themselves, it's usually because they have fallen into iniquity and God allows them to destroy themselves. But that usually offers an opportunity for some sort of spiritual rejuvenation. So that's usually what gives me hope when I think about these problems.
There are stories in the Quran, some of them are in the Bible as well, of course, of the destruction of previous societies for egregious sin through earthquakes and firestorms and so on. Perhaps our liberal social order is more likely to be destroyed through a kind of collective mental breakdown, which appears to be gathering force already. You see these horrifying statistics of increases in rates of self-harm and attempted suicide and prescription of antidepressants and so on among young people, and it seems to be producing this kind of psychic crisis that is gathering pace. Astonishing.
When the Apostle Paul, in his epistle to the Romans, writes about different communities that he's passed through, which had fallen into a great number of heinous sins and other crimes, he says, he gives an extensive list of what these crimes were and how horrible they are, and then he says, but God gave them the proper punishment within themselves and they were destroyed. Because essentially when a society becomes that sinful, it destroys itself because it can't sustain itself on that level of iniquity. And I think this is essentially what begins to happen with any sort of decay, is eventually the system collapses. But when it does collapse, there's always some bedrock to fall down onto. I think this is what we mean when we talk about this.
Do you think that the prospects of some kind of serious religious revival in the Western world are good before this kind of breakdown happens?
I'm not too sure. I wouldn't want to speculate, but I would guess that there's always a good chance, and there's certainly a lot of interest in this sort of thinking, even amongst people on the left who are growing disillusioned with it. As for whether a genuine traditional revival will sort of spring up before any kind of major crisis, I'm not sure. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I would guess if I had to make a prediction that there's a crisis would be more likely to precipitate change than anything else at this point. But as I say, I don't know. God knows, really.
Okay,
God alone knows.
Well, I think we can both agree on that. So perhaps on that note, we'll bring things to an end. So thank you all for listening again. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Hope you all found it somewhat interesting and edifying, perhaps. And hopefully we shall be doing this again before too long. So thank you.
God bless and keep you all. Goodbye.